which I strongly recommend people to look at, is, I don't know about other countries, but in India we've destroyed our rivers and streams. That, apart from the Ganges, most rivers dry up for 3, 4, 5, sometimes 7 months a year. You can walk across them during the dry season. And we have developed water harvesting structures, basically check dams, small dams, 100 meters wide, costing maybe $10,000. The return on investment for which can be 1,000%, maybe 2,000%. Because with those dams, within 2 seasons, you can actually get a perennial river back again. And the water that gets in fills up the aquifers fill up the wells. The women don't have to walk for 3, 4 hours getting the water. You have fish, you have recreation, you have irrigation water, and in most cases, really most cases, like 80% or more cases, you can go from 1 or even 0 crop to 3 crops, 2.5, 3 crops. So you can imagine what kind of returns that gives. Now, the biggest hurdle to that is mobilizing the social investment, mobilizing the investment by mobilizing communities to take charge of their lives, either savings or borrowing from the banks, and doing it collectively. To get collective investments is really the hard part. And because our model is very much based on self-reliance of communities to raise money and get things done for themselves, this is a very important part. I could certainly share more stories of the kinds of things we do. Our website is www.devalt, Development Alternatives, .org. And you're welcome to look it up because we've got much of the stuff on there. But I think in my humble opinion, I think we've got to get a combination of what you might call mechanical technologies of the modern world, together with traditional technologies of managing forests and soils, because there's a lot known about after all people did live in harmony with their resource base, and try to basically figure out how to do it. Population increases, growth has been so steep that in some cases you really do have to make other fairly drastic interventions too. But basically, in my opinion, we can't run away from using pumps and machines and better food storage and toilets and so on as part of the process of regenerating the resource. Thank you. I'm going to call on the next speaker, and then I'm going to run, I'm afraid. The next speaker is on ecology and poverty, and it's Jane Carter Ingham from WCS. Thank you.
So my name is Carter Ingham. I work for the Wildlife Conservation Society, where I lead the Ecosystem Services Program, and I'm going to be talking today about a recent 2-volume series that some colleagues and I just released. My colleagues Fabrice de Klerk and Christina Robatis Del Rio, who unfortunately can't be at this conference. And really the genesis behind the idea of these books started when we were all postdoctoral fellows at the Earth Institute, which many of you may know is directed by Jeffrey Sachs, who had a major role in the Millennium Development Goals. And at the time, the 3 of us who had backgrounds in ecology realized that ecology really wasn't being leveraged to its full potential outside of the world of conservation. So really people dealing with food security and water and energy issues weren't thinking hard about how ecology could help them achieve their goals. And it's not really surprising because ecology's kind of been limited to a small world and hasn't really thought about people as species themselves within a system. So we started exploring some of these issues and how ecology could be better leveraged to influence global poverty reduction through an editorial and review in Frontiers of Ecology and the Environment, and through various workshops that we hosted at the Ecological Society of America meetings, where we were surprised that we had huge amounts of interest in both these papers and in the workshops that we were hosting. And based on that, we were asked by Springer Publishers to write a book on the topic of integrating ecology and poverty reduction, which we did. And so we brought together 60 authors across various disciplines, people who were leading ecologists like Gretchen Daly and Shahid Naeem, and a range of other practitioners like Michael Jenkins and Julie Marsh from USAID, to think hard about how ecology could better contribute to poverty reduction. And it was supposed to be one book, but because it ended up being a massive project, Springer asked us to divide it into 2 volumes. The first volume addresses the ecological dimensions of poverty, and the second volume addresses the application of ecology and development solutions. And as I mentioned, because we were at the Institute at the time of the beginning of this project, we used the Millennium Development Goals as a sort of starting framework. And we asked all of our authors to either consider their ecological subdiscipline in relation to one of the major development challenges, or if they worked in a development field, to consider how ecology might help them achieve their work, further progress in their fields. And we ended up, actually, I'm going to talk about a few of the key messages from each of the books, but I should have mentioned that in Volume 1, rather than sticking purely to Millennium Development Goal framework, we adjusted it a bit and addressed hunger, water security, energy security, human health, climate change, and hazards. And in the second volume, we addressed some of the mediating forces that might influence the application of ecology for development solutions. And we addressed education, gender relations, demographic shifts and transitions, markets, and governance. So we used this as a starting framework, but we adjusted it a bit. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the major messages that came out of the 2 different volumes. And one of the first that came out of many different chapters, many authors described and illustrated how ecological science, particularly understanding of the functional roles of flora and fauna species, could be applied to optimize the services that landscapes and seascapes provide, particularly to rural farmers. And this is just an illustration from one of the chapters led by Sean Smuggler, and he's written by several co-authors, that showed how different landscapes managed in different ways, the knowledge of how different species provided, the functional traits of different species helped achieve different development goals, could help farmers think about how different land use management practices might result in different development outcomes, and how those outcomes might be distributed spatially and temporally. So in this figure, you can see that if the landscape was left as forest, you get outcomes with respect to timber production, fuel wood, pollination, pest regulation, improved soil quality, water quality and quantity, and greenhouse gas mitigation. But you get very little in terms of food production. So agroforestry might be a better alternative as you get a little bit of everything. But in considering agroforestry, it's important to think about some of the negative impacts that might result from different communities with different species compositions. So in the chapters on health, Sam Myers illustrates how an agroforestry system implemented in Trinidad actually, due to the species that they selected, provided ideal habitat for an epiphytic bromeliad that in turn provided ideal habitat for the principal malaria vector in the area to increase malaria risk. So it's important to think about all of the different trade-offs, synergies, and potential unintended consequences that can result from different ecological management strategies. And ecology as a science, because it helps us understand the causal mechanisms, can help us understand what some of those are. So if that last figure showed how ecology might help us think about trade-offs across different development goals, but it's also important to think about trade-offs within different development goals. So, for example, it's important not only to increase food production, but also to think about the quality of food that's being produced. And in the chapter on nutrition, Rosalie Ramons and others look at how we can reclassify plant species used for food production on farms by the nutritional value that they provide. So thinking about them in terms of their functional traits with respect to protein and carbohydrates and vitamin C in this example. And what they found is that farms actually vary quite a bit with respect to their nutrient value distributed across the landscape. And so one thing that was interesting in their study of about 30 different farms were some of the farms that had very low species richness overall had relatively high nutrient content. And what you can do is you can combine an understanding of the functional traits that are important for resilience, for example, from an ecological perspective, like drought tolerance, nitrogen cycling, with some of the functional traits that are important for nutrient value, to get a better understanding of how resilient a farm might be, both in terms of social and ecological resilience. So another example of how you might apply functional traits to understanding various development challenges is related to disaster risk regulation. I don't know how many of you were at the session yesterday on investing in green infrastructure, but it was made clear that we need a better evidence base on how ecosystems contribute to disaster risk reduction. And in a chapter that a colleague of mine and I wrote in volume 1, we look at how using the ecosystem service provider framework proposed by Claire Kremen and Gary Luck and others can help us better understand what functional traits are important for providing disaster risk reduction services and apply that towards better disaster risk reduction strategies that are more holistic in reducing vulnerability not only to disasters but also to other components of poverty. In volume 2, we explore how ecology can be better applied to influence development challenges. And one of the important messages that some of the other speakers have already highlighted throughout their talks, and that came out in all of our chapters, is that it's really important for ecologists to think about the social, economic, and political context in which they're working. Too often ecologists sort of work in their own little world without thinking about the social and human setting in which they're devising experiments and applying their results. But to make their work more effective, they really need to think about the social, economic, and political context. And these maps reflect how men on the left-hand side and women on the right-hand side depict the very same landscape or ecosystem in maps that they've drawn. So men highlighted ecological components in the landscape that were more associated with productive activities, while women focused on ecological components in the landscape that were more associated with social rituals like collecting water and household needs. And finally, in some of the chapters on payments for ecosystem services and markets for poverty reduction, authors highlight just how important it is to get the ecological science right when developing these mechanisms. Sashadina and Nelson describe how an understanding of how migratory wildlife use nutrient-rich grasslands outside of Tarangire National Park was critical for developing a payments for ecosystem service program that's now functional and is providing a very important source of discretionary funding, the only source of discretionary funding for the Maasai village that's receiving these payments from private sector tour operators. But as Brendan Fisher points out, it's really important that we think hard about what the objective of those PES or market-based approaches are, because it's really difficult to achieve two objectives with one mechanism. And he shows that if we try to optimize for ecological conservation, we may compromise on poverty and vice versa. So just to summarize, from volume 1, it was clear that ecological science and tools haven't really contributed very much historically to poverty reduction efforts, but there's huge potential for ecology to be better integrated into a variety of different development sectors. Ecology can be very useful, as we know, through a lot of new initiatives like the Natural Capital Project, in highlighting trade-offs and the unintended consequences consequences that might happen as a result of siloed or sectoral decisions related to natural resource management or development. And understanding the causal mechanisms, which ecology helps us do, can really help highlight what help us avoid some of those unintended consequences. And by understanding some of the synergies amongst different components in an ecosystem, we can devise strategies for a landscape that optimize across different development goals, and ideally, and in many cases, in a very cost-effective way, which is important during times of economic austerity, as many countries are going through at the moment. And so then finally, it's really important, this came out of volume 2, that ecologists in the science they conduct have to be viewed as objective. So, and that can be really tricky when many ecologists work with conservation organizations and they may be viewed as prioritizing biodiversity over development outcomes. But it's important that whoever's working on development problems, ecologists included, have to understand the prevailing social, economic, and political context in which they're working, or else their work probably won't be very effective. And related to that, it's really important that the scale of the development problem, or whatever the research project is designed to address, is designed at a scale relevant to decision making. And as some of our authors pointed out in the section in the chapters on demographic transitions, some of the relationships between humans and the ecosystems in which they interact change at various spatial scales. So it's important to keep in mind how those relationships, human environment interactions, change across scales. And it's critical that we collaborate with other disciplines. As was mentioned in the previous talk, ecological science or natural-based solutions have to be most likely paired with engineered solutions or other solutions. So it's really important that ecologists collaborate with professionals from other disciplines. And it's really important, all of the authors have pointed to the idea that we really need to start thinking about humans in a different way. We need to think about humans as a player in the ecosystems and not removed or isolated from the systems in which they live and operate. And that's it.
Okay, thank you very much. The last three speakers, I won't say thank you to myself. We've just got 10 minutes to have some quick questions to the speakers. We'll keep it fairly informal. There's a microphone in the middle, which I think you can walk around with. So we can pass some questions around. Perhaps you can just pass the mic around. We've got 10 minutes for questions before then we can actually get into sharing some specific examples through our dating system. I'm going to choose Ed Barrow first.
This one work. Ed Barrow, thank you very much for those presentations, they were great. Can I play devil's advocate a bit? The question comes out to me afterwards, playing devil's advocate. So what? What does this mean in terms of policy change at the national level? Are any of these programs yet influencing national accounting, macroeconomic planning, and financial allocations, so that there's improved recognition of the very values you're talking about, which we recognise, but if they remain there, they remain as nice facts and figures, they will continue to be lost out of the national mechanisms. Thank you.
And perhaps we'll just have two answering that question. I won't try and get out of questions, by the way. I will pass it on. Oliver, perhaps you...
Great. Thanks for that question. That's a very good question. So glad that I was the person to try and answer it. Well, thank you indeed. No, I think the equation should. We're a pretty small organisation. We work within the environmental energy group within UNEP. we also work closely with the small grants program. I think there's building a coalition of groups that would advocate for investment in local, and that's what we see with the results of the Equate Initiative 10-year piece, also the SGP 20-year piece, and in terms of policy advocacy, I don't have examples to give, but that's what we'd argue for, making the case for smart investment in local solutions.
I certainly agree with the point you made, and just to echo Oliver, I think making the case at a local level is very important. And I think we saw yesterday, again, going back to this investing in green infrastructure discussions, that we actually still do need the evidence base at a local scale with a lot of these challenges. But as I mentioned in my talk, connecting your research or whatever study you're doing from the ecological perspective, which is what we were addressing, to the scale of decision making is critical. So I completely agree with the statement. I think it's a challenge we should all be aware of.
I think